Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Sarah Backrack. I'm part of the Speakers Committee and a Northampton neighbor. And welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have this talk. Northampton Neighbors has more than 900 members, and we're an all-volunteer group, and we're trying to help each other age in place. We have one staff, and that's Diane Porcelli. She's wonderful. We suspended services because of COVID, but we still have the speakers series, the talent show that you may have seen last week, and check-in calls. And slowly, who knows, we may get back to services in person. We're working on that now. We have Nina Kleinberg here, who is our tech guru, and she will help us if I falter or if we have any problems. We're going to have Jennifer's talk, then a question and answer. We try to use the chat box for our questions. If you can hold off till toward the end of the talk for your questions and add them in the chat box, because she may answer them as she continues. Could everybody please mute themselves as you come in? That would be very helpful. So there's a chat button in the bottom. You click on the chat button, write your questions and enter. And there's also subtitles that you may be seeing as I speak going across the bottom. If you want them, click on the CC. If you do not want them, click again. There's also Otter up at the top left-hand part of the screen. If you click on Otter, you'll get a transcription if you want to read along the talk as we go forward. Nina's going to record it, and it's recorded. You can then see it or tell friends who couldn't make it today to listen to recordings on the Northampton YouTube and on Open Media. Open Media has just agreed to have all of our talks on there as well. And we'll please continue to be muted until the question and answer period comes. Jennifer is going to talk for 20 to 30 minutes, then we'll open it up to questions. If we have a small enough group, we can put it on gallery and people can ask their questions, but we're going to start with chat. Jennifer, I'll now introduce Jennifer. Jennifer Taub is a graduate of Yale and Harvard Law School. She's testified before the banking law before Congress. She's a financial expert on the crisis of 2008. She also is the co-founder in April 15th, 2017 tax march to try to demand that Trump releases tax returns. She's a professor of law at Western New England Law School, and she's been on CNN. She's written lots of articles and many newspapers. She has many books. Other People's Houses is one of the most famous or the most read, I guess. And she received the Vermont Law School the Phenomenal Woman Award. And she wrote Big Dirty Money, The Shocking Injustice and the Unseen Cost of White Collar Crime. And she's going to talk to us about that, and then we'll open it for questions. Jennifer, welcome, and thank you very much for doing this.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Nina, for inviting me. What a wonderful organization. I only wish this were not a pandemic and we could be seeing each other in person. There's something that you just don't get, a lot that you don't get from a screen. So I am speaking of screens, I'm about to share my screen with you. And the plan, as Sarah mentioned, is for me to talk no more than 20 minutes and then open it up to questions. And if you have a question as I'm talking, please feel free to put it in the chat now, because I can always, I don't want you to forget your question. And it may be something that you ask, and then if I happen to, see it, I can address it early on in the Q&A. Okay, can everybody wave at me if you can see the slides? Okay, great. I'm going to now move from here. So I want to give you fair warning. Although Sarah said some very nice things about me, occasionally you get a critic, and here is one of my favorite critics over on Amazon. Somebody who names himself or herself, themselves, thank you all, called the book Radical Propaganda, Let me read from the review. This is exactly the type of garbage that is polluting the minds of our youth. A horribly written book that not only will I not give away, but will burn at the next campfire. Atlas Shrugged is literature. This is rubbish. You are warned. Log off now if you do not want your mind polluted. Okay, so there were also, I'm going to skip these, but there were also some nice things people said that I'm sure my publisher would want to tell you. So there that is. So my roadmap for the talk today is to first define the problem that compels me to write about this topic. Then I'll describe some proposals, including their benefits and shortcomings to address this white collar crime spree. And then I want to invite questions. And were we in a real room, I would want to make introductions and do a reading. But because we cannot really make personal introductions, I have, and I don't want to read directly from the book in this kind of setting. I'm going to make some other introductions. And here is the first introduction. It's to Wells Fargo CEO, John Stumpf. He is standing here holding his injured right hand aloft because he was being sworn in to his Senate testimony. When asked, this was shortly after I think he had testified before a House committee in 2016, after it came to light that Wells Fargo, the bank he led, was enrolling customers in accounts, setting up accounts for them without their consent. When asked, spokesperson said he'd been playing with his grandchildren when he injured his hand. I had envisioned he had punched a wall, but maybe not. Anyway, here he is. And on his watch from 2009 through 2016, the firm opened 3.5 million bank accounts without authorization of customers. They also repossessed cars because people fell behind, in part because they were paying for insurance premiums they had not authorized or needed. While this fraud was going on, the bank was retaliating against employees who resisted participating in the scheme. And at the end of the day, after this came out, he resigned in what is, the euphemism is, in disgrace. But disgrace is nothing compared to the $134 million exit payment he was able to keep after the company clawed some money back. In 2020, the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency fined him and banned him from ever participating again in the banking industry. He had already retired at 66 years old with his nest egg. No criminal charges were brought against him. And then I'd like you to meet Governor Bob for Jobs McDonnell. He was elected in 2008, began serving as governor of Virginia in 2009. He accepted more than $175,000 in cash loans, luxury vacations, gowns for his wife, and also a quite lovely silver engraved Rolex watch with his initials on it from a friendly constituent named Johnny Williams. This was in exchange for access. These are not allegations. This is actually admissions. It was in exchange for access because Johnny Williams he was hoping to be able to get studies done so he could get FDA approval ultimately for a tobacco-based, I don't know what you would call it. Maybe the legal term is snake oil. And anyway, he was never really able to get the product off the ground. Ultimately, Governor McDonnell was convicted for bribery, and his conviction was overturned in 2016 because although there was a clear quid pro quo, a this for that, paying for access is not unlawful. Only paying for an official act and arranging for meetings, hosting hosting Johnny Williams at events, even though all these things were clearly given this access was provided, introductions to people who could fund his research and theory at the universities in the state. That was not an official act. Payment for access, even big payments, is not a federal crime. Then let's meet the Sackler family. This is a big drug dealing enterprise. And this, the company Purdue Pharma earned more than $35 billion selling, the company earned $35 billion selling OxyContin, which was an opioid the company claimed was less addictive than others because of a time release mechanism built into the drug, but they knew this was not true. It was just as addictive and just as easily diverted. They were worth $14 billion. Back in 2006, the company pleaded guilty to mislabeling, a violation of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetics Act, and they paid $600 million, but they kept on selling their drugs. In fact, we learned just in the last few months that the company had, immediately upon entering their, it was actually a 2007 guilty plea, but immediately upon entering their guilty plea, they began a decade more of a criminal conspiracy. And under the William Barr Justice Department, Purdue Pharma entered into a multi-billion-dollar settlement. But yet the Sackler family, neither in 2007 nor the 2020 settlement, have been charged with anything. Hundreds of thousands of Americans died of prescription opioid overdoses between 1999 and 2017. They were a repeat offender. As part of this bankruptcy, the DOJ was able to arrange this settlement. So far, again, no members of the Sackler family have been charged with anything. There were 3 executives back in 2007 who entered guilty pleas for misdemeanors. No one went to jail. Bill Barr's Justice Department touted this drug bust this time around in 2020. 2 different criminal counts, a complex conspiracy that included lying to the drug enforcement agency, that included a violation, a conspiracy to violate the Food and Drug and Cosmetics Act again, and also a violation of the federal anti-kickback scheme, a law where they were paying physicians to prescribe the drug, all of this. And still, it almost seems as if those in the know believe that the Sacklers, although they personally paid $200 million, just a dent in their fortune, none of them are being charged. They have not been cleared, but the suspicion is they're not being charged because they were willing to have their corporation, their business enterprise, pay billions of dollars to make sure they would never, ever be incarcerated. Okay. Then there is also one last introduction is to Martin Shkreli. We know of him as Pharma Bro. This is a photo of his punchable face from congressional testimony regarding price gouging. Ultimately, he was convicted related to securities fraud, unrelated to price fixing. And he said something that was pretty telling. Barely an hour after the verdict, he was on the internet live streaming YouTube from his apartment, holding a beer and predicting his sentence would be close to nil. That wasn't true, but was totally on the money when he said that if he does go to prison, it will probably be a club fed where he'll play basketball and tennis and Xbox for a couple of months. Yes, at a club fed, these minimum security prison camps, you can play basketball and tennis. You cannot play Xbox. And at these, here's one club fed, Otisville. This is a place where Michael Cohen, I believe the president's former lawyer, was in prison here. And I often like to look at the offerings of the various minimum security white collar crime prisons. And here I'm just have a little excerpt from the welcome guide. Plenty of recreational activities. They've got cardio equipment, bocce, horseshoes, handball, tennis court, and so on. Also, there's a very lengthy commissary list where if you have money, you can avail yourself. I was particularly interested in the plantain chips, Twizzlers, and matzo ball soup. I'm not so sure the prices will hold because they are subject to change. At one point, I actually, to do investigative research, asked a friend who was a federal prosecutor, do you think that I could get admitted to a club fed just, you know, to live there for a week to see what it's like? And she assured me that no one would let me do that. And I will not commit a crime in order to gain access, I assure you. Okay, now that we've met some of these folks, and I've got a few minutes to talk about the problem and the solutions. I lay this out in the book. I mean, I think that the problem right now, the chief problem, is that we are in the midst of an elite and corporate crime spree for which people who are white, wealthy, and well-connected believe they have, and often do have, a kind of implicit immunity where they are going to given first, second, and third chances, and very rarely are prosecuted, and if convicted, land in a fairly cushy situation. Having your liberty taken away is never a good thing, but this is not supermax where they are going to. The second problem is right now in the federal justice, in the U.S. Justice Department, there are not enough resources being dedicated to this very serious problem, I believe, since the Enron era. And the laws, including the anti-bribery statute and many others, the tools that prosecutors would use, have been weakened through court interpretations, and Congress has not stepped up for various reasons to make the laws more powerful. Our third problem is that too often we see white collar crime as victimless, and victims' voices are not heard. And it makes it more difficult for prosecutors to prioritize these offenses, and more difficult even for victims to recognize that they are victims and know even how to report white collar crime. The fourth problem is that our best defense against and way to detect this kind of crime by the most powerful is through journalist exposés and internal whistleblowers. And we're increasingly seeing threats, violent threats to journalists abroad and here in the US. And our whistleblower protections are very confusing and not strong enough, and they need to be strengthened. My fifth concern about the problem is an underfunded IRS. This is getting a lot more attention. When I wrote the book, it was annually an $800 billion tax gap. And that tax gap, what I'm describing, is the amount of money that the IRS knows it is entitled to, but just doesn't have the resources to collect. Now it's up to $1 trillion. This absolutely makes no sense. The analogy is, with a Madoff crime Ponzi scheme, we have Irving Picard, the trustee, who's able to get back, I think it's now close to 80% of the non-paper losses, getting back to people the money they put into Madoff, huge amounts coming back, using all kinds of detection to do this. It's costly. His law firm is doing this, but why doesn't the IRS outsource this to very good, high-powered law firms and accounting firms, so they can go collect this money if they don't have the resource or the budget to hire people, or the ability to hire people who have the skills, training, and connections to hunt this money down. And finally, when it comes to white collar crime, because we don't have a consistent definition of what it is, and we do not have any federal or state or local agencies actually sizing and collecting data on the problem, we really can't tackle it. It's the you can't manage what you don't measure issue. So what are the proposed solutions? The proposed solutions align fairly nicely with I shouldn't say nicely, I'm deliberately aligning them with what I see the problems are. I think the most important thing is that we need an elite crime division within the Department of Justice that focuses on this, the way they did when they had an Enron task force, but having it more be a corporate crime, white collar crime, and public corruption task force that has its own dedicated FBI and is very focused on preventing, detecting, and prosecuting as a way of deterring this kind of elite predation. We need to strengthen various of our laws, and the book, I went through some of those. I believe we need also a white collar offender database. So it creates a disincentive for firms and for individuals to get these slaps on the wrist that the information about the complaints, if they are credible complaints, and the settlements is in one place. We need to empower whistleblowers and journalists, and I talk about the laws and ways to do that, as well as federal funding. Restore the billions of dollars of funding to the IRS and adjust their priorities. Now they're going after very low earners instead of where the money actually is. And ultimately, we do also need to fund agencies so we can better track the kinds of white collar offenses that may start as complaints or investigations in agencies like the Securities and Exchange Commission or the IRS, where they just maybe get dropped and not pursued criminally. So we can at least track the universe of possible complaints, the way we can track criminal complaints that do or do not get pursued when they're street crime. Okay, so I've talked about each of these things. I'm going to skip through. There's more detail here. One thing I want to focus on before we break for questions is, to me, the most promising thing is expanding the False Claims Act. And I'm working in a more detailed Law Journal article piece about this, but so that you know, the False Claims Act was a law passed under the Lincoln administration. It's sometimes called the Lincoln Law. And it's considered now to be the US government's chief weapon against fraud. But the problem is this law, Lincoln's Law, or it's also called the Informer's Law, is limited to fraud committed by businesses and individuals who contract with the US government. And when it was first enacted, it was addressing the concern that suppliers to the Union Army were using wartime shortages to gouge the federal government and provide low quality, overpriced goods. So there were things like shoddy uniforms that were like glued together and would just fall apart at the seams. The statute contained, and still contains now, what's called the qui tam provision. So this gives individual citizens standing to sue on behalf of the government, even if they don't have anything to do, they don't have with the entity that's cheating the government. And the government is given an option to take control of the case and pursue it. And if the government takes control, they can make it a criminal case or they can make it a civil case. And if the government says, you know what, we don't want to, then you, as the informer, could bring it forward yourself. At the time this statute was passed in 1863, Senator Howard from Michigan said that this law was based on the old-fashioned idea of hold out a temptation and setting a rogue to catch a rogue. And the whistleblower, who's called a relator, would get half the money received at the time when it was first passed. So there are antecedents in England and the colonies. Now, over the years, the law has sometimes been scaled back and strengthened. In 1943, it was eviscerated because Congress eliminated the bounty fee. So there were no incentives. And the law slumbered until around 1983, when there was this case I write about in the book involving General Electric, who was contracting with the federal government. As a result of the attention brought to that case in 1986, there were amendments that were designed to restore the bounty fee and to provide better protections for whistleblowers. To give you a sense of how powerful this law is, in 2014, which was the high watermark for False Claims Act settlements, the Department of Justice collected $5.69 billion, $3 billion of which came from cases that whistleblowers initiated. And the states all have their own version of False Claims Act statutes. What interests me the most, which is going to where my research is going, is that California has a really unique one where consumers can report fraud and sue people who they believe are defrauding private insurance companies, even if the state didn't lose money. So keep this in mind. This is why it's so interesting. Right now, the False Claims Act, which is very successful at stopping and holding accountable people who try to defraud the US government. California has a law where if I lived in California, if I thought a company or a person was committing insurance fraud, I could sue them on behalf of the insurance company. The thinking is that I'm harmed because my insurance premiums would go up if someone else commits insurance fraud, if they put in claims, like they burn down their own house or their own business, that's going to raise everyone's premiums. This is a pretty profound expansion of the notion of a false claims law. Okay, so let me just go back. My idea is to try to expand the federal False Claims Act statute, similar to what's going on in California with insurance, but to apply to any kind of fraud by a company, whether it's consumer fraud or insurance fraud, or anything like that. Now, the downside, the pros of this is, and also I want to harmonize all the different whistleblower laws because they're a patchwork. So on the one hand, it sounds really great. Maybe we would prevent more fraud. Individuals would have more standing if the government didn't want to go after, let's say, some company that provided a lot of jobs or gave a lot of campaign money to a particular group of officials. The downside, though, is, I don't want to live like the film The Lives of Others, the Stasi. I don't want neighbors telling on neighbors and things like that. So there's got to be a way to have a dollar threshold here for a federal statute that would only really focus on major fraud and not try to incentivize a lot of tattletelling and create kind of discord among people in their, in their communities. Where I leave you before questions is, I think focusing on holding the elite accountable is extremely important. And I like to imagine a world where the government had actually held Donald Trump accountable for the many offenses he committed, which I write about in the book, well before he launched his presidential campaign in 2015. And as my friend, a Pulitzer Prize winning journalist, Jesse Eisinger, has observed, that's a world where President Trump is an impossibility. Thank you so much. Your questions are welcome.
I'm going to jump in for just a couple of minutes to give a short spiel about Northampton Neighbors. We're a nonprofit group and we rely completely on grant writing and donations. If you're able, please go to the Northampton Neighbors website, northamptonneighbor.com, press on the donate button and donate whatever you can, or mail a check to Northampton Neighbors. We appreciate whatever you can give us because we love to have these talks and do all the things that we're trying to do. Let me just also announce that May 7th, Jane Lerner and Michael Kane from the Voter Movement Project is going to talk about grassroots organizing and electoral power, which may be very appropriate for some of the stuff that Jennifer is suggesting should happen. On May 21st, Jennifer Restuccia from Cooley Dickinson Hospital is going to do a talk called Home Sweet Home and Keeping It Sweet as We Age. She's going to talk about adaptive equipment and other kinds of things we can do to make our homes much safer and keep us in our homes. Jennifer, your talk was wonderful. I read your book. I find it really easy to read, a little bit overwhelming and depressing, but we really appreciate it, and I think everyone here appreciated. We haven't learned how to clap on Zoom, so I just applaud your talk, and let's open it to questions. Do you want to go through the chat, or would you like me to give you the questions?
I'm happy. I mean, do we want to do, I like human interaction. Is there a way to have that other suggestion where we do gallery view and let people talk, or?
We don't usually, but we only have 32 people. So why don't, Nina, can we give it a try?
The first question comes from Sarah. Sarah, do you want to tell us? And then, so we'll be doing Sarah and then Naomi, Gerstle, and then Barton Big. So Sarah, why don't you go first?
Okay, a question I had when I was reading your book is it more effective to have the minimum alternative tax or to stop the use of all the tax breaks?
So I'm not sure what you mean by minimum alternative tax. Do you mean like a flat tax?
Yeah, I think Biden is doing a minimum alternative tax for offshore companies.
So just offshore, just repatriating the offshore money as
So
opposed,
far.
you don't mean a minimum alternative tax, a flat tax across the board.
No,
Yeah, I mean, I think it's important to repatriate that money, but I also think it's important to admit that the money isn't like it's actually offshore. I mean, the money is being accounted for. You know, when you look at companies that have a lot of cash on their balance sheet, and you can look at some of them, they're able to treat that as on their balance sheet in the US for purposes of what or the stock prices and everything else. So, I'd like to know more from other tax policy experts, what they think about. To me, we need to reverse the 2017, Trump tax bill. First of all, second of all, we need to deal with the tax gap. And third of all, I think we need a wealth tax. I really support Elizabeth Warren's idea. And
Okay.
Naomi, what's your question?
My question, it's Mark Carpel's question. He isn't feeling great, so his camera's not on, so I'm asking the question for him. And that's actually a question I wondered about. So where does Elizabeth Warren's Consumer Protection Bureau fit into these remedies? And do we know what its status is under President Biden?
Great question. Thank you, Professor. I know you're a proxy for somebody else for this. So yeah, Elizabeth, so the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau is a federal agency that doesn't have criminal enforcement power, but it was the agency who did blow the whistle on Wells Fargo initially. And I think that the CFPB is an important investigative authority who can then refer cases to the Department of Justice that warrant criminal prosecution. So some of the sort of mixed blessings are that under Trump appointed various people in a series to head the CFPB who were not interested in protecting consumers. In fact, one of them wanted to change the name from the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to like take the word consumer and bury it at the back, if that doesn't tell you a lot. So as part of, the banking community has never liked the CFPB. It was not in the draft of Dodd-Frank that they did, the reform bill, and they've been fighting it ever since. And one of the things they were fighting, and they successfully did, is they fought this idea. The way the CFPB had been structured is that the president could not fire the director of the CFPB. And the Supreme Court decided that this violated the separation of powers to allow Congress to create a federal agency that had executive authority and was not, at the power, the head of it wasn't, if there was a single head, the president would have no control over firing. So the good news is Biden has the authority to choose his own head of the CFPB. And what I don't know is, I know that he's appointed the head of the SEC, but I don't know if he has who the new head of the CFPB is. Whether there's only an acting head now, right? And maybe you can tell me. And I don't know. I'm embarrassed to say whether they have nominated someone to head the directive. I'm looking right now, and Kathy Kraninger was the old head, which we know was not great, but I don't know. I'm looking on my phone right now. She resigned when Biden became president, and I don't know if he has a new, oh yes, oh my gosh. Yes, now I'm remembering. Biden nominated Rohit Chopra to head the CFPB. I don't know if he's been to his confirmation hearing. I have met him. He is amazing. He actually, I think, worked at the CFPB years ago, chosen by Elizabeth Warren, and he used to be on the Federal Trade Commission, and he is very pro-consumer. So I'm very excited about his role, but I don't know that he's actually been taking his oath of office yet, but he's very promising. So thank you for asking. And the next person is Barton Big.
Hi, I don't have my camera on, but I do look like that picture. I'll just read it. Thank you, Jennifer, for your work. I just wrote, I find I'm as outraged by white collar crime as those on the other political extreme are by quote unquote illegals or socialists or demonstrators they call terrorists and so on. Would it help to have entertainment and culture create such sensational narratives of crime for white collar criminal that we are bombarded with for the kinds of crime that people are constantly outraged by?
So I'm trying to shine a light on this. I think that it's important, and I never, let me just make clear, I think people should, I'm not censoring anyone's creativity. So if someone wants to do that, that's great. Where I want to be careful to put my energy though, is not, for me, I don't want to create caricatures of reality. I want to show it exactly how it is, because I think it's really important that we don't, that we point to the ways that companies that aren't being accountable and individuals who should be held accountable, and the way that and improving the justice system and doing that. But I do fear part of the project of the conservative, anti-majoritarian, multiracial democracy, right? You know, the existing Republican Party. Part of their project is to undermine all institutions and turn. My lighting just went. Can you still hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, the lights just went off in my house. Okay. Maybe my husband is working on something in the basement. I don't know. But part of the project of them is to create enemies and create divisions. And you sort of see this how, you know, Republicans are now attacking the companies who are against Georgia's, you know, anti-voting rights laws and so on. And I always want to be telling the truth and championing the good things businesses and politicians do, because undermining our faith in institutions is dangerous for democracy. And you undermine it by not telling the truth in either direction, if that makes sense. At least my opinion.
Thanks so much.
Yep. Other questions?
I have
Sarah?
another question. The Citizens United decision by the Supreme Court in 2010, do you think that needs to be changed, or can it be changed? And how horrible has that been for all of this white collar crime?
I mean, it's terrible, right? I talk a bit, you know, I think that I was just earlier talking to someone today on a podcast about the bribery decision, the overturning the conviction of the governor of Virginia, and how the weakness in our anti-bribery statutes exposed by the Supreme Court is a big problem. But I also do think the 5-4 Citizens United decision is a disaster for a number of reasons. And I do hope that there is a constitutional amendment that is very narrow and effective. I shouldn't say the word narrow is wrong, that is effective in dealing with the influence of big money in politics, and not just corporate funds, but also the funds of, you know, multi-billionaires individually spending unlimited dollars to influence elections. And we've got a lot. I really recommend looking at the chapter on public corruption, because Citizens United was one of the most significant, but actually not the first and not the last one that is causing problems for our democracy. So yes. And by the way, I'm part of a group called Free Speech for People that's interested in fighting this kind of money that corrupts politics. And I also was on the board of the Citizens Commission in Massachusetts that put out a report in December of 2019, and it is still ongoing. I'm no longer part of it, dealing with recommending a constitutional amendment, and that Massachusetts support one to limit the effects of Citizens United. Kathleen.
Yes. I was wondering if anything has ever been attempted to change the prison system so that the white collar crime doesn't get elite treatment.
So the Bureau of Prisons, boy, that system, I have not seen a proposal where they say, let's take the insider traders and tax evaders of the world and put them in a supermax. I haven't seen anyone suggesting that. I think it should be the other way around. I think if we're going to, there's some people who are complete prison abolitionists. I think that, people who shouldn't be in prison for drug crimes, I think if they're addicted, they should be in treatment. And that's, but I do think that prison should not be the way it is. If you're incarcerating someone, they should not be in a cage. They should be in a room. They should be safe. They should not have roommates where they're in danger. I mean, there's so much I think we need to do to make the non-white collar prison situation be up to par with the other, with when you have violent criminals, of course, with safety measures put in place, but the prison should not be cages, period. But I would not, it's not my goal to expand the carceral state, right? And I don't think we can put every single person who commits a crime in jail, but I think more, I think more of their money should be taken away. And I think white collar crime should be better prevented. And I think we should have fewer people in prison who have less power in the society. I mean, look, like, for example, today, on the other side of this, in Massachusetts and many other states now, we have recreational marijuana is fully legal. Why do people have to actually hire a lawyer or apply for expungement? Expungement should be automatic and should be the state's burden to do that right now. For marijuana and other small nonviolent drug offenses. There's just so many things that's where I would put my energy into. And I do think that equal protection wise, the prison system should look the same for all people. And it's really not the same for white wealthy people as it is for everybody else. The exception proving the rule, Jeffrey Epstein. Other questions?
We do have a few more minutes if we have any last questions. I did have one other question, but it may be way too small, and that is, what can we as individuals do besides calling our legislators? Especially in Massachusetts, our legislators tend to vote correctly.
And yet we still have prisons here that, you look at someone like Lois Ahrens. I mean, I think, who's working on the prison issues. We still have those concerns. I mean, I think we have to do things like thank people like Maura Healey, our Attorney General, who has been really pushing hard back against the attempted civil settlements with Purdue Pharma. She's someone who's named the Sackler family. I think that we need to ask our members of Congress here, when are they going to back legislation or introduce legislation that would tighten up the anti-bribery statute? I haven't seen them doing that. That might be a good idea. And I think it's important. Our voices actually matter as consumers. It turns out consumer boycotts scare the crap out of companies. I mean, look what happened with the companies around the voting, around the voting rights. I mean, to me, I care a great deal about white collar crime, but let me just be clear. Right now, the emergency we have is that Trumpism hasn't gone away. And the states across the country are trying to eviscerate voting rights. And none of what I'm talking about can even move forward at all if the Democrats lose control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And it's only if they get solid footing that I think we can move any of this forward. So if I were asking people to do anything, it would be to be doing work on voting rights and voting access right now.
Okay, thank you very much. We're sort of unmuted, so we can do some level of clapping. I appreciate it very much.
Have a lovely weekend, everybody.
And you too.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.